Adam Bandt, welcome to Insiders.
Morning, Fran.
Adam Bandt, on that day, the fire warning had been increased to catastrophic for the first time ever in this country. Do you accept that that kind of language on that day is not only insensitive but is out of line?
I think you should listen to the emotion in Jordon Steele-John's voice as he's talking there. I think he's the youngest member of Parliament. He's part of a generation that is terrified and aghast with what they're seeing with the climate crisis. What we're seeing now has happened with 1 degree of warming, and they know we're on track for 3. And they are terrified. And unless the government gets the climate crisis under control and reins in its use of coal, then this generation is going to rise up with a fury that is matched only by the intensity of the fires. So people may quibble about the words that he used, but I would urge people to have a listen to the point that Jordon was making.
OK, but it's about the words. It's about the words why people were fighting fires, fighting for their lives, fighting for their homes, fighting for their communities, and to have a politician standing up and use their tragedy and their trauma to score a political point. They didn't like it. Do you accept that?
Well, we can have a discussion about the words that are used, and we could have that all day.
We will, because you started it. I mean, it was you on the Sunday who accused the Prime Minister of putting towns and lives at risk. You don't regret those comments?
I don't, and here's why. Scott Morrison has been put on notice, and his government has been put on notice for many years now, that if we keep digging up coal at the rate of knots that we're doing at the moment, it is going to contribute to making global warming worse, and that is going to make bushfires like this more likely and more intense when they happen. Now,
OK, all points to be made, but do you think people are looking back and looking on and going, where do the Greens draw the line in exploiting a human tragedy to score a political point?
Look, this is about protecting life. But the first duty of government should be to protect its citizens and to protect life. Scott Morrison should be able to say, hand on heart, he has done everything in his power to protect people's lives, and he can't. He has done the opposite. And I spoke to someone who lost their home in the fire over the weekend. And she said to me very clearly that she wants the country to know that she is a victim of the climate emergency. Now, Scott Morrison can't have it both ways. He can't say, oh, look, there's very little Australia can do because we are a small player, and then refuse to go to climate crisis summits, snub the rest of the world, and then come back here and cuddle coal in Parliament. He has contributed to this situation.
OK, but the words you were using, it's hyperbole, isn't it? I mean, you said Scott Morrison has not got the climate crisis under control. The Australian Prime Minister can't get the climate crisis under control.
Well, again, if I was Prime Minister, I'd be saying, let's get Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, let's get our Pacific Island neighbours, let's go and knock on the door of China and the US and Russia and say, global warming is burning our country, our rivers are drying up, our reef is dying, we need a global effort to get out of coal, we're prepared to lead it, next, let's do it. And instead, Scott Morrison is being a tiny Trump. He's calling this negative globalism. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But then when he comes back here, he refuses to pull any of the levers that he has at his disposal to cut pollution. In fact, he's increased it.
Well, talking about pulling levers, I mean, it was the Greens back in 2009 who didn't pull the lever to give Australia an emissions trading scheme. This Kevin Rudd CPRS, it was the Greens who used their votes to defeat that. We could have had an emissions trading scheme and a price on carbon in this country for 10 years. We could have been well along that track. So you can't have it both ways, to use your words.
Bob Brown reached out to Kevin Rudd and said, let's just talk about some sensible amendments so we can get it through, and Kevin Rudd wouldn't even have the conversation.
Well, there'd been plenty of amendments, there'd been plenty of conversation. When it came to a vote, the Greens said no.
But what I can tell you...
Nothing is better than something.
Well, maybe had it gone through, then maybe Tony Abbott and Rupert Murdoch in 2010 would have run their 2013 Axe the Tax campaign.
Like, well, maybe we could have had a scheme in for 10 years.
But let's talk about what did actually happen. There's one unalterable fact. The only time pollution has been cut in this country, and we've taken some steps to tackle the climate crisis, is when Greens had some shared power, we worked with Labor and the crossbench, and we got a carbon price in place, and it worked. And looking back now, I think if we're going to start talking about accountability, it is the coalition who tore down the only thing in Australia's history that has started cutting pollution and tackling the climate crisis, and they have contributed to the situation that we are in at the moment.
Just in terms of the fire and what can be done in the future, we had that group of emergency and fire chiefs, former emergency and fire chiefs, stand up this week calling on all parties to declare a climate emergency. They're calling for more resources, more efforts on mitigation and adaptation. Will the Greens accept the advice from these experts around, for instance, the levels of hazard burning, if that means they suggest more backburning, more clearing in national parks? Because this is a criticism that's been handed to the Greens all week, that the Greens, not you, but Greens and environmentalists have been getting in the way of the hazard burning.
The short answer is yes, that's our policy. Our policy is to support hazard reduction burns. But what the fire chiefs are telling us is that even that is becoming more difficult in the climate crisis. And they're also telling us that the kind of mega fires that we're witnessing at the moment aren't always spreading along the ground. They're going along the treetops, and embers are being flown sort of several kilometres ahead, because that is the kind of mega fires that we are facing. And when the fire chiefs, Scott Morrison and Michael McCormack say now's not the good time to talk about climate change. Well, they didn't want to talk about it in April when the fire chiefs tried to get in the door. They didn't want to talk about it in September. They didn't want to talk about when the Climate Crisis Summit was on at the United Nations. The reason that they're saying don't talk about it now and trying to distract with other things is that they don't want to talk about it at all, and they understand that they are making the problem worse.
OK, well, what would the Greens do about it? Your policy is get out of coal in 10 years. I mean, we've seen at the last election the response to a party, the Labor Party, who was talking about climate change and not really fully backing the coal industry in the way, to use your words, cuddling coal. We've seen what happens. We've seen the politics of that. Getting out of coal in 10 years is just fanciful, isn't it? It's a $70 billion... it's worth $70 billion to our economy.
No, it's not fanciful. It's what we need to do if you accept the science. And you can't
but if you did that, you would decimate some of those communities. You would put a huge chunk of a hole in the economy.
What we need is a plausible jobs plan for people in Queensland, people in New South Wales, so that we can make the transition. We could turn Australia into the renewable energy superpower.
In 10 years. Make that transition without a huge knock to the economy in 10 years?
Absolutely. How long did it take to put someone on the moon? When you had leadership and they decided that we want to make this a national priority and they put resources behind it. Look, at the moment, we've got historically low interest rates. Let's take advantage of that opportunity and invest in green infrastructure. Let's build 100% renewable energy. Well, let's go for more than 100%. Let's export it to countries in Asia. Let's make our place, our country, the country in the region that you come to if you want to have clean, cheap, renewable energy to power your
Okay, so how do you do that? How do you get to the starting line? We've had, for instance, a policy, the National Energy Guarantee. Malcolm Turnbull got thrown out, essentially, because of it. Since then, Labor has said, bring it back, we'll support it. Business says, we'll support it. Energy users and energy companies say, we'll support it. The Greens won't support it. Why don't you support the only policy that's even vaguely near the table at the moment?
Well, that's not even the government's policy at the moment.
No, but if you joined that coalition of voices, don't you think there'd be the votes in the Parliament for a start for the government to get it through? They would know that. Why not add your voice to it?
Look, just as when when Greens sat down with Labor and the Independents and negotiated the carbon price, which reduced pollution, was it our perfect policy? No. Was it a good start? Yes, it was.
So
and
would
it
you
began
support
to
the
cut
neg
solution.
if it could get to the table?
Well, the government needs to come and make the first in-principle decision. And Scott Morrison needs to show some leadership. Scott Morrison needs to accept that the climate crisis is real and that we're going to do something about it. If he then wants to do what John Howard did after the Port Arthur massacre and say, I'm going to bring everyone around a table, I accept that we've got it wrong, I'm going to stand up to some elements in my own side of government and tell them that they are wrong, that we now need to lead on the climate emergency, of course we'd be at the table. You would find everyone at the table. But that is the decision that he's got to make first. And at the moment, he's gone to ground because he knows that he does share some responsibility and he's refusing to be held to account for it.
OK, let's just go finally to your side of politics now. It's the Greens National Conference happening in Canberra this weekend. Former Greens Senator Andrew Bartlett has called for direct action of the Greens leader by the membership to be fast-tracked. He said, why wait, let's do it now. Do you support the direct election of a Greens leader by the membership?
Well, our party is going to make a decision. We'll make a decision at our next national conference in May.
We've been trying to do it for a few years now. What's the hold-up?
We've got a strict timetable in place now. That means we're going to have a decision in May. Look, personally, I do think that there's a role for members to have a say, whether direct election or some other mixed model is the right way to go. I look forward to that discussion that's taking place at the moment, but I do think there is a role for greater membership involved.
Would you support, if it came down the side of full membership election, would you support that?
Look, I think that the members of Parliament should continue to have a say, but I'm open to what that model is and how that's done. And I think it's going to be a pretty good discussion over the next few months.
And Bandt, thank you very much for joining us on Insiders.
Thanks very much, Fran.